decisions made outside the room. The most important decision was never discussed in the meeting where everyone was present. By the time the doors closed and the conversation officially began, the outcome was already leaning in one direction. This matters because power inside the White House does not always operate where the microphones are. Some decisions are shaped long before the room fills, in hallways, in private conversations, in moments that leave no transcript and no record of consensus. The Oval Office is often portrayed as the center of decision-making, but in reality, it is a final stop in a much longer process. By the time an issue reaches that room, assumptions have already hardened, options have been filtered, urgency has been assigned. The debate begins late in the story. This dynamic begins with preparation. Briefings are written, talking points are refined, participants are chosen carefully. Each step narrows possibility. Each step removes friction. What appears to be an open discussion is often the end of a negotiation that happened elsewhere. Advisors understand this instinctively. Influence is strongest before positions are public, before arguments must be defended. A quiet conversation can redirect an issue more effectively than an hour-long meeting ever could. And once that redirection happens, reversing it becomes difficult. The president may sense this without fully naming it. A decision feels natural, logical, supported, but that sense of inevitability did not come from the room itself. It came from everything that happened before it. At first, this seems efficient. Meetings are shorter. Consensus appears faster. Conflict feels resolved. But efficiency achieved this way hides something important. When decisions are made outside the room, accountability becomes harder to trace. Debate becomes symbolic rather than substantive. This story begins at that moment of realization, the moment leadership recognizes that the most consequential choices may no longer be happening where they're supposed to. Because when decisions are made before discussion begins, the room stops being a place of judgment. It becomes a place of confirmation. Once decisions begin forming outside the room, the meeting itself changes character. Questions are asked, but their answers feel predetermined. Alternatives are mentioned, but quickly dismissed. What looks like deliberation functions more like alignment. Inside the White House, this shift is subtle but powerful. Participants arrive already sensing which direction the conversation will go. Some reinforce it. Others test it gently, reading reactions before pushing further. Few challenge it directly. The room has already moved. This dynamic thrives on preparation. Pre-meetings shape expectation. One-on-one conversations set tone. By the time the full group convenes, momentum has weight. Reversing it would require visible resistance, and visible resistance carries cost. The president may not realize how much has been decided in advance. From their perspective, the meeting feels orderly, focused, free of chaos. That order is appealing, but it can also mask the loss of genuine choice. Advisors who disagree face a dilemma. Speak up in a room and risk being isolated, or adapt and influence from the margins. Over time, many choose the latter. Debate migrates outward. The real discussion happens earlier, quieter, and among fewer people. This creates a feedback loop. The more decisions are shaped before the room, the less the room matters. And the less it matters, the more influence shifts to informal spaces. Authority remains formal. Power becomes informal. The danger is not secrecy. It is compression. When complex decisions are compressed into informal consensus, nuance is lost. Assumptions go untested. Minority views fade. The system becomes faster, 97 but thinner. The White House now faced a familiar tension. Efficiency versus depth. Predictability versus surprise. Meetings that feel decisive versus meetings that actually decide. The conflict was not about process for its own sake. It was about whether leadership still had access to genuine disagreement before committing the nation to a path. Because when decisions are made outside the room itself stops protecting against error. And error, when unchallenged, compounds quietly. The conflict reached its peak when a decision made this way produced consequences no one in the room could fully explain. On paper, the meeting had gone smoothly. Consensus had been visible. Objections had been minimal. And yet, The outcome exposed assumptions that had never been debated openly. Advisors retraced the process and found the truth uncomfortably clear. The real deliberation had happened elsewhere, in side conversations, in informal agreements, in moments when not everyone was present. By the time concerns surfaced publicly, momentum had already carried the decision forward. The president felt the weight of this realization. Leadership had not failed because of poor judgment, but because judgment had been exercised too early, too narrowly, and without sufficient challenge. The room had confirmed a path rather than tested it. This was an emotional turning point. Not frustration, but recognition. Recognition that the system designed to protect against collective error had been bypassed by convenience. That efficiency had displaced scrutiny. That agreement had replaced examination. Some advisors defended the process, arguing that informal consensus was unavoidable in fast-moving environments. Others warned that the cost of speed was growing. Both were right, but the balance had tipped too far toward decisions made quietly, before leadership could feel the full weight of trade-offs. Silence settled in the room, 97 not because there was nothing to say, but because everyone understood the implication. If the White House continued this way, meetings would become theater. Decisions would harden before challenge, and leadership would lose its last line of defense against blind spots. The president recognized the core issue. Authority still sat in the room, but influence had drifted outside it. And when influence moves elsewhere, authority becomes reactive rather than directive. This was not a failure of trust. It was a failure of structure. The system rewarded early alignment over open disagreement. And unless that changed, every future decision would carry the same vulnerability. The conflict had reached its deepest point. The question now was whether leadership would reclaim the room 97 or allow it to remain a place where decisions were merely announced after fact. The resolution came through redesign, not reprimand. The president chose to reclaim the room by changing when and how decisions were shaped. Pre-meetings were limited. Informal agreements were surfaced early. Full discussions were scheduled before momentum could harden into expectation. Inside the White House, the shift was uncomfortable at first. Meetings became longer. Disagreement resurfaced openly. Some decisions slowed as assumptions were challenged in real time. But the room regained its purpose in 97 not as a stage, but as a safeguard. Advisors adjusted, knowing that genuine debate would occur publicly. They brought their strongest arguments forward instead of settling them privately. Influence moved back into the open. Authority and power realigned in the same space. The president felt the difference immediately. Decisions became heavier but clearer. Trade-offs were visible before commitments were made. Surprises diminished, not because outcomes were perfect, but because risks had been acknowledged honestly. This change did not eliminate informal influence. It never could, but it prevented it from becoming decisive before scrutiny. The room mattered again, not because it produced harmony, but because it produced challenge. Decisions made outside the room had once felt efficient. Now they felt incomplete. Leadership reclaimed its last defense against collective error, 97 the ability to hear disagreement when it still mattered. The lesson was simple and enduring. When decisions are shaped too early, leadership loses choice. When debate is delayed, accountability thins. And when the room becomes a formality, power has already moved elsewhere. By reclaiming the room, the White House reclaimed judgment. And sometimes, the most important leadership decision is not what is chosen in 97, but where that choice is truly made. So what do you think? Should leadership value speed or the discomfort of real debate? Decisions